Called me a liability in front of the entire staff, 32 people. I counted them later almost like a reflex, because my brain needed something to hold on to while my chest went hollow. My son-in-law didn't even look at me when he said it. He was standing at the head of the conference table, the same table my daughter's grandfather built this company around 40 years ago. And he was talking about restructuring for velocity and eliminating bottlenecks. And somewhere in the middle of that, he looked up from his slide deck and said, "That includes legacy positions that are costing us forward momentum." Then he looked right at me. "Hank, effective today, your role is being eliminated. We appreciate your years of service." Years of service, like I was a vendor contract they were letting expire. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my jacket pocket, set my building key card and my server room badge on the table and pushed them toward him slowly. The room was so quiet, I could hear the plastic sliding across the wood. Then I picked up my coffee mug, the one that said "One Grandpa" that my granddaughter gave me, and I walked out. I want to tell you everything, but I need you to understand something first. I am not the kind of man who talks about himself. I spent 31 years at Mercer Logistics building systems, solving problems, and keeping my head down. I came up from loading dock supervisor to director of operations, not because I played politics, but because I showed up. Every time something broke, a carrier relationship, a customs delay, a warehouse fire in Memphis, I was the one people called. Not because it was my job title, because I knew how to fix it. My daughter married my son-in-law 8 years ago. He's smart. I'll give him that. He has an MBA from Wharton, and he can read a room, and he knows exactly which words to say to make investors feel warm and excited. He flew out to Silicon Valley twice a year, came back with new vocabulary. Synergize, pivot, disruptive infrastructure, and slowly, over the last 3 years, he started spending more time at the company. My daughter never wanted to run it. She's a pediatric nurse in Charlotte, and she's wonderful at it, and she has no interest in freight logistics, which is fine. When her grandfather passed and left the company to the family, my son-in-law stepped in as CEO. My daughter trusted him. I trusted him too, in the beginning. The first warning sign I missed, he stopped asking me questions. For years, whenever there was a carrier dispute or a compliance issue with DOT regulations, he'd come to my office. We'd sit down, I'd walk him through it, and he'd nod and take notes. Smart kid. Willing to learn. That changed about 18 months ago. He started bringing in outside consultants instead, young guys with laptops and frameworks and very confident handshakes. They would interview me for 45 minutes, write a report, and present it back to leadership as if they'd discovered fire. I didn't complain. It wasn't my company. I just kept doing my job. Here is what my job actually was, in plain terms. I maintained relationships with every major carrier we used. FedEx Freight, XPO, a dozen regional truckers who gave us priority rates because I'd personally negotiated those contracts over years. I managed our customs broker relationships on the import side. I knew which warehouse supervisors in our network would actually call me at 2 a.m. if a temperature-sensitive shipment was at risk, and which ones wouldn't. I had the direct cell number of an FAA compliance officer I'd worked with during a cargo incident in 2019, the kind of contact you cannot get through a LinkedIn search. I also maintained our TMS, our transportation management system. It was older software, a system called McCloud, which is common in mid-size freight companies. My son-in-law's consultants called it legacy infrastructure and told him we needed to migrate to a newer cloud-based platform. I told them we could do that, but it would take 8 to 12 months to migrate cleanly, and we needed to run parallel systems during the transition, or we'd have gaps in carrier connectivity. They put together a 90-day migration plan. I told my son-in-law that 90 days was not realistic. I put it in writing. I sent him an email on March 14th. I remember the date because it was the week before our Q1 push, our busiest season, and I laid it out clearly. 90 days creates exposure. We need parallel systems. We need a longer runway. He forwarded it to his consultant. The consultant replied that my concerns were noted. That was 3 months before he fired me at that conference table. The morning I walked out, I went home and sat in my garage for about 2 hours. Not doing anything, just sitting. My wife came out eventually and handed me a cup of coffee and sat next to me in the other lawn chair and didn't say anything either, which is why I've been married to her for 34 years. Finally, she said, "What do you need?" I said, "A few days." She nodded. She went back inside. I sat there until the coffee got cold. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't call anyone at the company. I didn't warn any of the carriers. I didn't leave a manual, an instructional document, a transition guide, not because I was trying to sabotage anything. I want to be clear about that. I had spent weeks before my termination asking my son-in-law if he wanted me to document my processes, train a backup, create handover materials. Every time he waved it off. "We have the consultants," he said. "They're mapping everything." So when I handed over that key card, I had done everything I was supposed to do. I'd offered, repeatedly, in writing. I am not responsible for what happened next, but I'll tell you what happened. The TMS migration had been running for 6 weeks when I left. The consultants had moved about 40% of our carrier connections to the new platform. The other 60% were still on McLeod. The problem was that McLeod required a system admin to manually renew API tokens every 90 days for carrier EDI connections, electronic data interchange, which is how our system talks to the carrier systems for tracking, invoicing, load tendering. It's not complicated if you know it exists. It's catastrophic if you don't. My access credentials expired 12 days after my termination, so did the API tokens. I was the only person who had ever renewed them, and I had never been asked to document the process. The first thing that broke was the XPO connection. Shipments stopped updating in our system. The operations team thought it was a bug in the new platform. The consultants spent 3 days troubleshooting the wrong thing. Meanwhile, XPO started routing our loads to other customers because our tender responses weren't coming through. We lost our priority status with them, a status that had taken me 4 years to negotiate. Then the FedEx freight connection dropped. Then 2 of the regional carriers flagged our account for non-communication and put us on manual-only processing, which added 2 to 3 days to every transaction. I found out about this from an old colleague who still worked in operations. She texted me on the Tuesday evening, "Hank, things are really bad here. I probably shouldn't be telling you this." I thanked her, and I didn't respond further. It wasn't my company anymore. My son-in-law called me on a Thursday, exactly 22 days after he fired me. He didn't say hello. He said, "I need to understand what's happening with McLeod." I said, "Okay." He said, "The carrier connections are down. The consultants can't figure out why." I said, "I see." He said, "Can you walk me through it?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I sent you a written proposal for a consulting engagement last week. Did you have a chance to look at that?" He got very still on the phone. I could hear his breathing. Then he said, "You want to charge us to fix this?" I said, "I want to be compensated for my professional expertise. Yes, that's what a consultant is." He said, "Hank, you have a responsibility." I said, "I'm not an employee anymore. You made that very clear." He hung up. My daughter called me 2 hours later. That was a harder conversation. She's my daughter, and I love her, and I could hear that she was scared. She said, "Dad, people are going to lose their jobs if this doesn't get fixed." I said, "I know, and I'm sorry, I want to help." She said, "Then help." I said, "Tell your husband to sign the consulting agreement. Standard rate, 60 days. I'll fix the carrier connections, document everything, train his operations team, and do a proper parallel migration." I offered to do this while I was still employed. He declined. There was a long pause. She said, "He's going to say that's extortion." I said, "It's a standard consulting contract. Sweetie, I've submitted the same paperwork to 3 other freight companies in the last 2 weeks. This is my job now." Another long pause. "Okay," she said, "I'll talk to him." The agreement was signed 48 hours later. My rate was $400 an hour, which is actually below market for a logistics system specialist with my experience. I documented that clearly in the contract, along with the scope of work and a 60-day timeline. I want to address something here because I know some of you are going to say it. Was I being petty? Was I holding the company hostage? I've thought about that a lot, and here's my honest answer. No, I don't think so. I had offered in writing to do this work as an employee. That offer was rejected. I had offered in writing to create transition documentation. That was dismissed. When I was terminated, I was given a standard 2-week severance for a 31-year employee, which in most states, including ours, is perfectly legal, but not exactly generous. I didn't go to an employment attorney, though several people told me I should have, because the termination had enough documented irregularities to make a case. What I did was offer my expertise on the open market. That's not extortion, that's commerce. The fix took 11 days. The API tokens were the core issue. I renewed them, documented the renewal process in a step-by-step guide with screenshots, and set up automated alerts for when they'd expire again. I also spent time with the operations team, walking through the McCloud to new platform migration properly, building a realistic 6-month roadmap instead of the 90-day fantasy the consultants had sold. While I was working on-site, at my old desk, which was a little strange, my son-in-law and I were professional with each other. Polite. Nothing more. He didn't apologize. I didn't expect him to. The company recovered mostly. They lost the XPO priority tier, which will cost them roughly $40,000 a year in rate differentials until they rebuild that relationship, and that'll take 2 or 3 years minimum. One of the regional carriers didn't come back at all. Those are real costs. Real consequences. I finished my engagement on a Friday afternoon in late fall. I handed the project documentation to the operations manager, a woman who had been with the company for 11 years and who, I should mention, had asked me 3 times in my final months of employment if she could shadow me to learn the systems. My son-in-law had never approved the time for it. I made sure she got a full day with me before I wrapped up on the company's dime properly. When I walked out that final time, I stopped in the parking lot and looked up at the building. It was the same building I'd walked into for the first time 26 years ago when my wife's father, the founder, had offered me a job because he said I was the most organized loader he'd ever seen. I thought about him for a minute. He was the kind of man who shook hands and meant it. He built something real. I hoped what was left of it would last. Then I got in my truck and drove home. My wife had made pot roast. We ate dinner and talked about nothing important. The neighbor's new dog, whether we should repaint the back porch before winter, our granddaughter's school play. Ordinary things. Good things. A few weeks later, I got a call from a regional freight broker I'd worked with for years. She'd heard through the industry grapevine what had happened. These networks are small, people talk, and she asked if I was available for a project. I said I was. That was 4 months ago. I now have 3 clients. I set my own hours. I work from home 3 days a week, and I drive out when I need to. I make more money than I made as a salaried director, and I don't have to sit through slide decks about disruption velocity. My son-in-law and I don't talk much. My daughter and I talk every week. She doesn't bring up the company, and neither do I. Family is complicated, and we've both decided that what we have is worth more than being right. But I'll tell you the thing I think about most. There was a moment right after he fired me when I could have made a scene. I could have stood up at that table and told those 32 people exactly what was about to happen. I could have said, I am the only person in this building who knows how the carrier connections work. You were about to find that out the hard way, and there would have been some satisfaction in that, I'm sure. But I didn't. I slid my key card across the table, and I picked up my coffee mug, and I walked out. I didn't need to say anything. Because I knew something he didn't know, and the systems, the ones I built, maintained, documented in my own head across 31 years, they were always going to tell the truth eventually. Some people ask me whether I regret not warning them, whether I should have called someone that first week, told the operations team about the API tokens, handed over my personal notes voluntarily. Here's what I tell them. I spent the last 2 years of my employment warning them. I sent emails. I wrote memos. I sat in meetings and said plainly, this is a risk. Here is how to mitigate it. Here is what will happen if you don't. Every single time I was told my concerns were noted. There comes a point where you have done your job. You have done it honestly and completely and in good faith. And if the person in charge decides that your experience is less valuable than a consultant's slide deck, then at some point you have to let them learn what they decided not to know. I'm not a villain in the story. I'm not a hero either. I'm a 61-year-old man who spent 3 decades building something real, got shown the door by someone who underestimated what real looks like, and then got paid his consulting rate to explain it to them after all. I still have the 1-1 grandpa mug. It sits on my desk at home right next to my laptop. Every morning I look at it and I think, yeah, that's the one that matters. I keep thinking about that moment when I slid my key card across the table. 31 years, and the room just watched. What strikes me now isn't the anger. I'm past that. What strikes me is how quietly everything unraveled. Not because I planned it that way. Because that's simply what happens when you remove something real and replace it with something that only looks real on a slide deck. My son-in-law is not a bad person. I want to say that plainly. He's ambitious and he's bright and he loves my daughter. But somewhere along the way, he confused confidence with wisdom and motion with progress. He looked at 31 years of relationship building, of 2 a.m. Phone calls of knowing which carrier supervisor would actually pick up on a Friday before a holiday, and he saw overhead. He saw a line item. He didn't see the architecture underneath everything his company was built on. That's not a character flaw. That's a failure of judgment. And judgment, I've learned, is something you can only build slowly. You build it by being wrong and staying in the room, by listening to people who've been doing something longer than you have, by caring more about whether the thing actually works than about whether your plan looks impressive in a quarterly review. I didn't always have good judgment either. I'll own that. I should have pushed harder to document my processes. I should have escalated my written warnings up the chain, not just to him. I stayed quiet in some meetings where I should have stood up. Those are my mistakes, and I carry them. But here's what I also know. I showed up every single day with everything I had. I told the truth even when it wasn't what people wanted to hear. I offered to train someone, to write the manual, to build the bridge between what I knew and what the company needed next, and I was told it wasn't necessary. I kept my integrity intact through the whole thing, including after I left. I charged a fair rate. I fixed what was broken. I trained the operations manager properly before I walked out for the last time. That's the part I can live with. There's something I've come to believe about how life actually works, not in a mystical sense, just in a plain, observable sense. The things you build with honesty tend to hold. The shortcuts you take tend to surface eventually. Not always fast, not always in a way that's obvious, but the gap between what's real and what's performed always closes, one way or another. Those carrier connections didn't lie. The API tokens didn't care about anyone's MBA. I spent 31 years building something real. My son-in-law spent 3 years performing disruption. When it mattered, the real thing was the only thing left standing. I'm not telling you this to feel superior. I'm telling you because I think a lot of people out there are in rooms right now where their experience is being dismissed, where the work they've quietly carried for years is being called unnecessary. And I want them to know, keep your integrity, keep your records, offer your knowledge in good faith more than once in writing, and then let the work speak. The one grandpa mug is still on my desk. Some mornings that's enough.